are continuing with our series on learning how to hear God. You know, there are a lot of voices out there that we hear that compete with the voice of God. In fact, there are just so many of them out there that these voices that we hear, they drown out His voice. That's why a lot of times we have difficulty hearing the voice of God, even though God speaks, as we talked about before, that God speaks to His people. And as we saw last week, my sheep hear my voice. And that's the word of Christ. And because of all these competing voices that we allow in our lives, we are so, as His people, oftentimes we are confused and we feel overwhelmed. And, you know, if you think about it, this world has really no shortage of Dr. Phil's and Donald Trump's and all these people who constantly just come out on TVs or in the social medias and all these things, and they tell us what to do and how we should feel and how we should behave in certain situations. So there are all these voices that we hear. But as we talked about before, we really need to hear God. We need to hear the Lord. How we need it so much. And even what has transpired this past week, we really need to hear the voice of God in the midst of all these people that are clamoring for different, bring up with all these different suggestions and solutions. What is God saying to us? Actually, I came up with this message before all these things happened because I just didn't have time to work on my message after the retreat, so I'm not able to really kind of address what has happened this past week. But you know, one thing is sure, that we, in every situation, we are to seek the Lord and seek to hear God, because it will change our lives. I think to hear God is to change. And here in this passage, we have a man who struggled with hearing God. It's a little strange because up until now, we didn't really get into the preceding chapters, but up until now, Elijah has been pretty much very keen on listening to God. He first listened to the Lord, and he responded to His prompting, to His initiative, and that's what that's what happened up until now. So, especially in chapter 18, there we see a man Elijah, that is so successful. He was demonstrating the power of God because there was no rain for over 3 years in the land of Israel, and the king of Israel, Ahab, and his wife, the queen, Jezebel, they were probably the most wicked, couple, the power couple in the history of Israel. They turned to the idols. They brought in the Baal worshippers, Asherah worshippers, prophets, and then, so they reigned with such apostasy that God was very not pleased with them, and there was no rain for over 3 years. And then the word of God comes to Elijah. Hey, I'm gonna just send rain, but we need to have this showdown. And so he calls Ahab and the 850 prophets, and on the Mount Carmel. And then, as we all know the story of how, so they set up 2 altars, one by the Baal prophets, and they're just praying to Baal to just rain, so that the rain will be there, praying all day long. They're even cutting themselves, and that was their custom. Self-mutilation was part of their ritual, and yet nothing happens. But then when they were gone, obviously there was nothing happening. And then at the end of the day, Elijah steps up, and he even just asks them to pour water over them, or over the altar, just to make sure that it's not by coincidence. And then he prays to the Lord, and then the fire of the Lord comes from heaven, and it consumes the altar and the bulls that were on it, laid on it. And there he just commands. And then all the Israelites, they were like, whoa, they see this incredible demonstration of God's power. And then they're, okay, wow, God, you are for real. I thought the Baal was like, he's a man, but it's not. And so he seized that opportunity to slaughter all these false prophets. Right? So there was Elijah in chapter 18 was a man of success. He was really standing up for God's honor. And it was a great spiritual victory. Then comes the chapter that we just read. And there is a complete turnaround that takes place. In verse 1, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. This great man of God who just prayed that there would be rain in front of all these people watching. And then the rain came. And this incredible things happened. And now he hears a woman's voice. Yeah, granted it was queen, but he chooses, strangely here, he chooses to hear a human voice over the voice of the Lord. Just one woman's threat. I mean, sisters, I'm telling you, like, you can make or break a man, right? But so this guy, so Elijah listens to her voice. When in chapter 8, leading up to chapter 18, he was not afraid of people. He wasn't afraid of the showdown with all these people watching. Can you imagine? There are like 850 people that were just ready, and there's just only one person standing up for God. And he was not afraid at the time because he heard the voice of God. And yet here, but now he listens to her and allows it to really influence him. He's afraid. He's fearful. And he does not wait for what God has to say about this. When the threat came, instead of waiting, God, what should I do? He heard, he chooses to hear, and then let it just sit in his heart, and then he gets afraid. Now, as he's in this state of mind, he was so afraid to the point that he was running away for his life. So how is he ever going to hear God's voice? What do we find here in this passage? And there's just a couple of things I want to bring out to you. And the first thing is that even in our failure, that grace of God wins. That what we see in this passage is God's grace is over human failure. And starting from verse 4, he even leaves his servant, and he goes on ahead by himself. And then he's asking, God, I want to die, right? I'd rather die. This is enough, right? I've had it. I'm so sick and tired of all this, like, standing up for you and just being your spokesperson, being your servant, being a prophet. I'd rather die. Right? After all that I've done here, right, all I get is death threat. What is this? Take my life away. Elijah got so depressed, and he hit a spiritual rock bottom, even asking God to take his life away. Forget about everything. Man, this being your servant, man, I've had enough. I'd rather die. He prays that he might die. But here we see the grace of God that is so evident, and it is so winsome. Elijah was tired of everything, and everything really became a burden to him. It took everything out of him, that showdown on Mount Carmel, that he was so drained of everything, and then he said, I've had it. Just no more of this. But the angel of the Lord comes to him twice and provides to sustain his life. You know the journey that you are about to take? It is too much for you. Come on, just eat this. What a grace of God, what an amazing grace of God that we see in this passage. Because if you think about it, Elijah was a failure. He was clearly a failure at this time. And can you imagine the triumphant mood of Jezebel and Ahab after this prophet runs away for his life? Look at him. See, he's no better. We knew it. We knew, we knew him, and we knew he was going to just run away. And also, can you imagine the reaction from the people of Israel after seeing this incredible demonstration of God's power, that there was going to be a complete turnaround and there will be a somehow revival in the land of Israel? But instead of like leading them as the man of God who took charge and just who stood up against 850 prophets and then just really destroy them, the man of power, the man of God, only the next day, he's so afraid, he's so scared that he's running for his life. Can you imagine the people of Israel, what their reaction would be like? They were looking to him. He would be the spiritual leader that would bring the nation back to God. And yet, he hears a queen's death threat, and he runs for he leaves everything behind. What would the reaction, if you were one of the Israelites at that time, how would you assess the situation? Wouldn't you be like really confused and really, what's going on? Right? I mean, is he really for real here? What just happened here? Imagine the damage that Elijah has inflicted on God's name, his honor, the prophet, the servant of God, being afraid and running for his life. And yet here, we see that God is not pointing finger at Elijah or condemning him. He doesn't say, man, Elijah, you blew it. I just used you in such a powerful way on Mount Carmel, and you should have seized the opportunity. He didn't say, you really dishonored, you really messed it up, Elijah. Forget you, right? I mean, after all that, the thing, and everybody was looking to you to guide and just bring everybody together. You had that one chance, and you blew it. Okay, you are no longer qualified to be my servant. And he could have rebuked him like there is no tomorrow. And yet, God, and even Elijah is asking God, I've had enough, just take my life away. Okay, I've had it, right? And said, oh yeah? Okay, then I'll grant your wish. Okay, I'm just going to take you. Okay? You're done, right? You really messed it up. Right? But rather, he says, even though Elijah is like basically throwing tantrum at God, he says, get up and eat, because the journey is too much for you. The will of Elijah was to die, to just give up everything and just disappear. But the will of God was to sustain him. That he continues to speak to him, continues to bring him, prodding him along. And that's what we see, the mercy of God on a man's failure, human failure. That even when we fail him, that we see that the grace of God is still with us, strengthening us and sustaining us. And as we think about our own failures, at times we may feel like, oh my goodness, I messed this up. Okay, I really just brought shame and dishonor to God. And how can God even use me? How can God even speak to me? I am not worthy. And yet the grace of God is greater than all of our failures. And he comes to us still. Hey, I am here to sustain you. I'm going to continue to guide you. Just trust in me. Trust me. And sometimes that's the most important voice that we need to hear, especially when we go through some failures, when we are really discouraged, when we are really let down. Once again, we need to hear a gracious voice of the Lord. And that's what we see, in this passage. And the second point that I want to bring out to you is also God's grace over human ignorance. God's grace over human ignorance, and that's what we see here. So as he's finally he got to the place, and then in verse 9, there he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So basically, once again, his tantrum continues. He's just whining and complaining to God. God, this wicked king and the queen, they have basically killed everybody, and I am the only one. Of all of Israel, I am the only one who is faithful to you. Right? I'm just so tired of this. I'm the only one, no one else. Right? I've been really jealous. And he's whining, and he just continues. God is asking, what are you doing here, Elijah? As he was in the cave. He's asking, is this what you should be doing at this moment? And this can be easily be transferred in our own situation, right? Because God can also ask us the same question. What are you doing in your own cave? Say, Michael, what are you doing in your own cave? Christine, what are you doing in your own cave? The question is, do we also hear maybe God asking us a question like this? All of us have our own caves that maybe not many other people may know. Maybe it could be a cave of insecurity, cave of jealousy. Maybe we may just dwell in a cave of anger, bitterness, pride, the cave of withdrawal. All of us, maybe in different ways, have our own caves that we choose to dwell. When things are not going well, when we are discouraged, we retreat into a cave of our own making. And we choose to just whine. We choose to stay in the cave, have self-pity party, and all these things. And Elijah was doing this. He was so distraught and so discouraged, so by this time just even angry at God, and chooses to stay in the cave. And God, in his grace, is once again calling him. What are you doing in this cave? Something that we need to ask ourselves. With all God's provision, his grace in our lives, what are we doing now in our own cave? If you are in the cave, or are you content with your life, minding your own business, living for ourselves, never bothering to find out what the will of God is for us in this season of our lives? So we see the ignorance of Elijah. Hey, I'm the only one. He condemns everybody else. He's the only one for God. And because of his ignorance, and can you imagine, God gave him his assignment, his calling, his purpose. He knew that. By this time, he ignores all of it, and only thing he does is complaining to God. So God comes to him. First, he manifests himself, and then what we see is then first that there was a great and powerful wind that comes, an earthquake, a fire, all these things come. And then for many of us, and maybe even Elijah may have expected God to show up in this manner. But God was not in it. God was not in this sensational, this incredible demonstration. But there comes this low whisper, gentle whisper comes. And there was God in it. A small voice was there. Now, oftentimes we look for incredible signs to discover God's will. I hear many people say, I need a miracle. I need God to show up right now in front of me, in my face, just right in front of me, to tell me, right? Or something just really drastic, something dramatic to happen in my life, to really just know God or what He wants me to do. Are we looking for some mighty wind, some earthquake and fire to fall, to come to us? Because oftentimes that can just lead us to really just look for sensationalism in our discerning process. But more often than not, God speaks to us in a gentle whisper, daily, every moment. And can we hear His small voice speaking to us, a caring, gracious voice here? And then for the second time, God again asks Elijah, what are you doing here? Why is God asking the same question again? He already asked him before, and Elijah already answered him. But he asks the same question for the second time. Did he forget that he just asked that question? No. The reason is because I really think that God is giving Elijah one more chance to reconsider his calling and his purpose for God in his life. Elijah was a prophet called to serve him and live for him, but he ignores his calling at this moment. It's like, I've had it, take my life, and I'm the only one. I've done all these things, and nothing happens. I'm so sick and tired of this, stubborn people, and I'm just tired of it, God, and I don't want to do this anymore. I don't really care what your purpose for me is now. I just want to do what I want to do. And yet God comes to him for the second time in a small voice. So what are you doing? God may also be asking the same question to us. What are you doing in your own cave? Do you know the purpose of God in your life? Do we seek to discern His calling in our lives? And what are we doing about this? The fact that we are still alive means to me, and it's a testimony, that God still has a purpose for us. Because I feel like if there is absolutely no more purpose from God, God may very well take our life away, but because there is still a purpose for us in this life, that God allows us to continue to breathe, continue to live, even to this day. There is a purpose for each and every one of us. Are we hearing His voice to discern and to follow Him? And here we see God recommissioning Elijah in verses 15 and the following. We see here, even in his ignorance, that God is faithful. We see the grace of God that is so evident. And even after God's revelation, Elijah is slow to understand, busy defending himself and complaining to God. But still, God recommissions Elijah. Here in this passage, we see a man, failure. He failed in big time. But the grace of God was even greater. The grace of God is ever embracing. It is so readily available to us as we turn to Him. What God calls us is to trust Him so that we may understand His calling and purpose for us in our lives, that we may walk with Him. And so as we just continue our quest and continue our journey in this life, that we may just look to Him, understanding His grace is so much greater than all our failures. We are not our failures. Sometimes we are hung up on the failures in the past, and that really make us paralyzed or say, oh, this is as far as I can go because I've messed up big time. God God says, no, you are not the sum of your failures. You are not the sum of your weaknesses, shortcomings, but you are so much more. What are you doing in your own cave? If you feel like you are in this funk or in this cave, right, God is still calling. What are you doing here? I have a purpose for you. So it is my prayer for all of us to understand that we may able to hear Him, to discern His will and purpose for us, and follow Him every step of the way. Let's pray.